Welcome. Good morning, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the AML RightSource podcast series. Great topic today. We're going to talk about the Everest 2025 research about the leading financial crime operating performers in the industry. With me is Dheeraj Maken, Brad Breslin, and myself, Ferko Spits. Do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll step right in. Dheeraj.
Thanks, Ferko, for the warm welcome. This is Dheeraj Maken. I'm practice director with Everest Group, currently leading the financial crime and compliance program within Everest Group. My key areas of research areas of interest are KYC, anti-money laundering, transaction monitoring, fraud, chargeback, and anything under the umbrella of financial crime and compliance.
Warm welcome, Dheeraj. Good to see you. Brad.
Thanks, Ferko. Brad Breslin. I'm the Chief Delivery Officer here at AML RightSource. So have the privilege of leading our 6,000 or so, 7,000 or so employees focused on managed services and professional services in our advisory business, exclusively focused on financial crimes. We're quite excited earlier this year with our designation as a leader in the Everest Peak Matrix. And looking forward to the conversation here.
Very good. And lastly, Ferko Spits. I head up delivery strategy and solutions for AML RightSource and look after most of our delivery strategy and solution design for our clients globally and all the work that we do in that space for our banking clients, crypto clients, fintech clients, payment service providers, etc. Let's jump right in. Dheeraj, and maybe a question to you first. You're conducting the Everest research periodically. Every year you put a thermometer into the industry to see what's out there in terms of key themes, key trends, but also to make a thorough assessment of who do you feel are the best partners out there for the financial service industry to partner with in terms of taking on financial crime operations. What do you feel is contributing to the leadership status of the firms that you have identified in that research to be the leaders of the pack?
Good question, Ferko. I take a step back and maybe provide an understanding of the entire assessment methodology. So basically what we do is we assess the different providers on two axis. One is the y-axis and the other one is the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the market impact, which reflects the provider's footprint and reputation. And how we look at that is by looking at the number of clients they have, the revenue per FTE, their portfolio diversity in terms of what kind of clients they have. Do they have tier 1, tier 2 banks? Do they have fintechs? Do they have other emerging buyer segments? And then another sub-dimension which contributes to the y-axis or the market impact axis is the value delivered, right? Which essentially comes from the client testimonial. On the x-axis, we do have vision and capability, which actually measures the ability to deliver sustainably. It also looks at what the strategic vision is, how the provider has matured year on year, the kind of partnerships they have done, the kind of service scope they have, the kind of innovation they bring into the table. And we also look at the delivery footprint, right? Again, all of these dimensions, the weightages of these dimensions essentially change year on year, depending on the macroeconomic conditions, geopolitical conditions, how the regulators are thinking, and how overall demand is evolving in the market.
Right. And on that, Dheeraj, what were the key themes that you were looking at when you looked specifically at 2025? You say, hey, these aspects change over time from year on year. We look at certain things. What were the key themes that you looked at for this?
So in the earlier peak cycles, what we saw that a lot of market impact or market adoption was primarily driven by scale and global reach, right? So providers who were able to deliver cost arbitrage through some of their offshore models dominated in the peak metric assessment. By 2024, the conversation started to shift from who serves the most clients to who delivers the most meaningful change, right? So now the buyers were also looking at providers who take operational ownership of the outcomes rather than just executing some of the transactional heavy workloads or just doing line of defense work, one sort of works. right? So they were also looking at, are they more prescriptive in their solutioning? Are they proactively solutioning for us? Are they able to solve some of our actual business problems rather than just looking at those CPMs and KPIs or those operational metrics, right? By 2025, now again, we are seeing sort of a paradigm shift, right? And now the adoption is getting deeply tied to regulatory agility, bringing in innovation in with agentic AI capabilities, Copilot, bringing in explainability when you bring in those transformations or AI related issues, because the regulators are also warming up to the AI interventions, right? So, but they are looking at, are your AI implementations organized or collaborated with human expertise or blended with human expertise? So they are looking at who are bringing in pre-built frameworks and playbooks, right? But then who are talking more about responsible AI implementations.
Dheeraj, on that point, do you see a difference in the type of underlying client that's adopting that focus maybe more heavily? Is there tier one banks that are really focused on providers driving that outcome? Is it crypto? Is it, your PSPs? Like, do you see a distinction in that underlying client base that might be driving some of this change faster than others?
Question. Actually, what we are seeing is, across the board, AI is something which the banks are talking, right? Transformation is something which they are talking about, right? But of course, tier one, tier two banks are the ones which are warming up to the idea more, because they now understand that the kind of investments they have done on the tech stack and the kind of investments they have done on people side of business is huge, right? So there is a top-down mandate that they need to now look more on how do they leverage the Copilot capabilities and how do they leverage the AI capabilities, along with bringing in the explainability and traceability part of things. And when that sort of mandate comes top down, banks also understand that it is not their core competency, right? They need to look at outside some sort of a managed services construct, or they need to look at some sort of third party risk management providers who can help them with these sort of transformations, right? Plus, they also understand that this is not a plug and play sort of transformation, right? It is something which will evolve, and humans and agents need collaboration. Then only it is something which will successfully be implemented in a banking environment. That too, where the regulators also bring in their the perspective shoulder to shoulder and support those sort of implementations. So across the board, I would say that this is happening. Of course, some of the newer entrants or smaller size regional, super regional banks might not be at that particular scale that they would be able to talk about these sort of implementations. But then major banks, major tier one, tier two banks are the ones who are warming up to this idea of implementation and transformation.
And what do you see in your conversation? Because of course you've done your assessment on the financial crime operating service providers like AML RightSource, but you've also done your due diligence by reaching out to clients and banking clients and payment service providers to talk through the terms. What do you see or hear from them in terms of the key objectives or outcomes that they're looking for when they're embarking on a agentic AI transformation or smart solutioning or point solutions in their current analyst operations work for instance, KYC or TM? What do you hear from them?
What I hear from them is that innovation is something which has moved from a digital enablement to an intelligent orchestration perspective, right? So we saw that a lot of GenAI integration was happening across KYC, transaction monitoring, AML. Think of SAR summarizations. Providers came up with demos, tools where they were doing SAR summarization using generative AI capabilities. And banks were also fine with that, because the end SAR filing is with the banks. Similarly, for alert triage, they were doing some sort of automations or point-based solutions, or even some of the providers were able to bring in sort of a perpetual KYC sandbox environment, right, into their platforms, which actually is embedding advisory and managed services. So banks really liked those sort of offerings where you are embedding advisory and managed services. Plus, they also like some of the modular, interoperable FCC platforms, because banks do not want another platform for any new function which they think of, right? They don't want multiple platforms for multiple functions. So anything which is offered as a BPaaS or as a service model was something which we saw banks really liked, and it was in a way part of the overall leader.
Would you capture that as one of the overarching trends that you see leaders exhibit in this year's matrix assessment that you did?
Yes. So that could be one of the overarching trends, because innovation wherein you are orchestrating an ecosystem by bringing in your domain knowledge as well as human judgment. And when your technology, domain, human judgment is working in sync, that is the kind of outcome, or that is the kind of operating model the banks are looking at.
And we see it, Brad. I think that that's something that resonates well with the client conversation that we're having, right? I mean, I see that in most of the client conversations that we're having, we are getting questions on not only, hey, what's the service levels and the skill sets of the people that you're providing? What are your training programs? How do you make sure that the capability of your people is top notch when it comes to the requirements, either current ones or new ones, but also what kind of innovations can you bring to help me perform my work in a smarter way, less human effort, more human judgment on things that can be automated? Brad, any reflection?
I think that's right. I think, hearing the validation from the client standpoint kind of aligns with what our thinking has been in our own evolution here at AML RightSource, from what was table stakes to get in the door, and that was really high quality transaction processing. And you do that really well, good production, good quality. But the clients are looking for more now. And so how do you marry that with the advisory solutions, the process improvements, and then clearly the technology and the automation and the Gen AI, and shifting from a more reactive posture with clients to a much more proactive posture? That's why you're leading our solutions team. Is we are I think seeing the same thing in market and the evolution of the client expectation to be one that is like a true partnership for transformation. So I think a bit of validation of our own journey, certainly aligning with client expectations as they're continuing to.
And I think, Dheeraj, I remember us having that conversation around insights are very important to derive from your operational execution. And those insights drive and fuel a lot of the transformation initiatives, and can be sometimes be the guardrails or the guiding force for some of these agentic AI initiatives that are happening, because they actually demonstrate and visualize the inefficiencies that are hidden in manual processes, and then can fuel some of these agentic AI conversations. So definitely a trend that we also see in market.
Of course, and it's a very valid point which you have picked up, right? When we talk about agentic AI, right, a major portion of that is agentic, right? So domain capabilities is something which will drive a lot of your transformation. Assume any machine learning model, right, that runs primarily on data. And with data, there is a concept, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So unless you provide them correct data, and unless you contextualize that data with the correct domain and the right set of use cases, right, that particular model won't become robust. So in order to make it much more efficient, bringing in that data, which essentially comes from the level of maturity of the service provider, you bring in the domain, which again comes from how mature you are, how your training programs have been, how your entire partnership landscape is. Are you able to tick box all the processes within the L3, L4 deep down? And essentially then all of these, are you able to orchestrate them end to end? Do you have a visibility on how the entire end-to-end process works, or are you just working in silos? So interoperability and also having an understanding of different processes, that is also something which came up as an overarching trend for us. And in fact, we were hearing from a lot of enterprises who, as Brad was asking earlier, right, in terms of can you tier them? So some of these smaller enterprises, tier 2, tier 3 enterprises, they were also very open to some sort of integration offerings where you integrate your fraud and AML, KYC, those sort of processes together, right? And if the function is not huge, it's easier for them to integrate, and then you're able to bring in or take out much more efficiency out of those sort of offerings rather than going ahead with a traditional approach of a separate function for fraud and a separate function for AML, KYC and all. So that sort of creative operating model is also something which we have seen that the enterprises have started accepting nowadays.
Dheeraj, Brad, and then both of you, right? Do we see that as one of the key trends that is shaping the FCC world over the next 2-3 years? And with that, what other trends are we seeing from our seats, our 3 seats, that are shaping the financial crime operations world over the next 2-3 years? I was keen to get your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think, continuing on Dheeraj's point, I think one of the things we see a lot in our client portfolio is really a bit of a migration out of second line into first line in some of these functions, and creating a more holistic client view in the first line across primarily transaction monitoring, coming out of second line in the first line. KYCs, generally sits there anyway. But I think from a non-technology AI, just from a process standpoint, we're seeing that. And I think that's driven a lot by more holistic view of client risk, quite frankly. And then secondarily, at its core, these are like pure operations functions. And so as the first line, are you better situated putting these functions in the first line with an operations bend? For us, thinking through the evolution of the market, where it's going, the adoption of AI, those things I think are strong tailwinds that support that continued efficiency that you get around managing the risk. And then certainly, Dheeraj and I were in Las Vegas not that long ago, and John Hurley, the new Undersecretary of Treasury, spoke and really talked from a regulatory standpoint in the US around shifting to testing outcomes as opposed to testing processes. And I think that's an interesting shift over the next few years that really is going to align with an approach for clients that really is around outcomes-based kind of models and business processes and solutions.
Yeah, I think Brad have covered it really well. I would just like to add on to that a lot of these macroeconomic changes, policy changes which are coming up, right, from FinCEN, or even the Genius Act, which has come up, right, which basically tells you that you need to treat stable coins in the same way as you treat some other payment transaction. So we would see a lot of outsourcing happening in the payment space, and then also in the overall crypto compliance space, right? So you would see evolving customer segments as well. Along with your existing traditional customer segments, you would see a lot of newer customer segment adding on to the buyer pool. So that is also one of the tailwinds. And then you need to see that a lot of reinvention will start happening. The way the enterprises are purchasing right now would also change, right? They would basically want their resources to be near to them. So you would see more of nearshoring, but then less dependency on FTE. Currently, if you are having out of your total mix, if you are having 90% of humans and 10% automation, so maybe 3-4 years down the line, that mix or that split would be 50.
Yeah. I recognize that, Dheeraj, and especially around, that's what we're seeing in our own portfolio right now, is the increase in the services that we're providing for crypto firms, the increase in service that we're providing for fintechs. It's a trend that's actually been kicking in probably more than a year ago at scale. Your interesting thing that you're raising around the shift from 10% automation and 90% people to something else. It was an interesting conversation a couple of weeks back with one of the heads of financial crime of a larger bank, and he's saying we're moving towards, this was really about how do you make sure that your human capital, as you get more automation, still has the skills to make judgment. And that is something that is really critical, I think, in our industry as financial crime service providers, is we have the obligation to make sure that the people, while the simpler roles get automated, that basic skill set is not lost as they mature, because we are seeing movement of the work that they need to do from being purely heavy lifting of data collection and cutting and pasting into much more judgmental activities that are happening that are now classically bound into an L2 or an L3 environment. That's an interesting observation, because you can argue that without having seen the basics, how are you then able to operate with maturity and with sense in an L2 type of environment? So interesting choices and observations for us to make.
I think on that point, Ferko, I'd be curious. I'll probably prejudge Dheeraj's answer here, but I would think that that's where the adoption of the AI really has to be married with like the deep domain expertise. Again, probably a pitch for AML RightSource and our deep domain expertise, but I can't imagine that the two of them would work as well.
Yeah, definitely. In the overall agentic framework, right, you would see process, technology, skill, and then data, right? 4 of these things would play a very important role. So providers who would be bringing all of these 4 components to the table, definitely enterprises would go ahead with those providers, right? When it comes to their agentic implementations.
And I think and this reminds me, this is a great conversation, a great comment, Dheeraj. This conversation that we had a couple of days back, it was in the crypto space, and we were talking about where is our support required. And of course, we're working in the operation space. We're doing L1, L2 work. We're doing TM, KYC work, screening work happening. And we had a conversation on where do these institutions, crypto institutions, really need help with? And it is applying for licenses in new markets. So I touched base with some of our advisory folks in our advisory team, and we're starting to talk about what are the propositions that we can make as a integrated service provider, having both advisory and the operations piece on stitching the two together. We have the domain knowledge, we have the regulatory know-how, and we have the operational knowledge. What's the value proposition that we can mature into over the next period? And I think that's, if you talk about trends in the market, I think more and more new joiners will look for some kind of integrated, holistic solution, end-to-end solution when it comes to these kinds of questions. But
yeah. And in fact, you can also think of not just the crypto firms, right? You can also think of how would you tend to the needs of some of these sponsoring banks, because there are a lot of banks digital banks who do not have a banking license, but then they're using the license of a sponsoring bank. Now the liability or the burden of truth or burden of evidence lies on the sponsoring bank, that the transactions which are happening from a digital bank, who takes care of the transaction monitoring, right? And what are the processes which they need to take care of, from both from an advisory and ops perspective. So currently they are not aware, right? And this is something which I had a discussion with a lot of these sponsoring banks while we were in Vegas during the conference.
Nice. I think we've covered a lot in almost 30 minutes already. Is there any closing comments as we close out 2025 and look for 2026? Brad, from your perspective, what do you have?
I think first off, we were really excited with the Everest output and our placement in the leader quadrant. So feels like it has validated our solution. And our clients certainly validate that on a regular basis. So, but it's always good to chat about where the market's going and staying ahead of that. So appreciate the time, Dheeraj. It's always nice to get together.
Same here. Yeah, of course. And we also enjoyed having multiple interactions, multiple demos with Ferko and his team, right? During the entire research which we did. And then we did this for 30 plus providers. We went ahead, talked to many of your clients, and throughout the year, we had conversations with the other enterprises, right? So this was a culmination of all of those conversations. Conversations is something which we really love a lot. And that's why I love this conversation as well. I came here and I was able to learn few more things. I was able to validate some of our findings. So yeah, it was good to be here. And it's always a pleasure talking to you all.
Well, thanks, Dheeraj, and echo that. And I think my closing comments on as we walk out of the 2025 assessment time it was a conversation rather than an assessment. That's how we felt like it. It was really parties coming together to share views and perspectives rather than us having to go through a proper assessment. So that dialogue is really valuable because we are able to then also learn and take some of the learnings back into the client conversation that we're having. And it helps us to optimize our service models going into 2026. We hear where we are well ahead of the pack, and we also are hearing where we are short, or we have to pick up a few percentage points as we sharpen the pen for 2026. Really looking forward to next year, but this has been helpful and insightful. And Dheeraj, really thank you for your time. Brad, thank you for your time. Speak to each other, and thank you listeners for listening in to this episode.